So I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction and some context, and then we'll dig straight into the questions, if I may. So this panel is about nature and business and how we can integrate it. So the term nature is gaining a lot of traction among businesses and public organizations where they're seeking to navigate the complexities around climate change action and integrate it with other critical nature ecosystems. Now, integrating nature into business and investment is about addressing the main drivers of nature loss. And these drivers are identified by the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and that's known as IPBES, so basically the scientists behind the trends. And IPBES identified 5 direct drivers of nature loss, and these are changing use of sea and land, so conversion of sea and land, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and alien non-native species, invasive non-native species. The 2 lesser well-known indirect drivers of nature loss is people's disconnect with nature and the resulting lack of value placed on the importance of nature. IPBES reports a host of really shocking statistics on the decline of nature. And also WEF, the World Economic Forum, outlines and states that at least 50% of global domestic product GDP is dependent or directly and highly dependent on nature, or at least moderately dependent on nature. IPBES reports that there's been 47% decline in natural ecosystems, 25% of species already threatened with extinction, 3/4 of land-based environment have been significantly altered by human actions. More than 1/3 of the world's land surface is now devoted to crop and livestock production, and up to 577 billion USD in global crops are at risk from pollinator loss. And 100 to 300 million people are at increased risk of floods, hurricanes, because of the loss of coastal habitats and protection. So negative trends in nature will continue to 2050 and beyond in all of the policy scenarios that have been explored by IPBES reports, due to the projected impacts of increasing land use change, exploitation of organisms, climate change. So this is where transformative change is absolutely needed to alter those policy scenarios. So my name is Hinkin Lee, Vice President with Next Energy Capital. I'm delighted to welcome a really knowledgeable panel of experts to discuss the integration of nature across businesses. Our panelists bring a wealth of experience from diverse backgrounds, providing unique insights from development and planning through to investment and nature-based solutions. I'm joined by Mike Barker, Operational Director at RPS Tetra Tech, Rachel Taylor, Lead Planning Manager at Nat Power UK, Catherine Deegan, Vice President in the Investment Banking Division at RBC Capital Markets, and Alex Tozer, Chief Operating Officer at Replanet. I haven't done that in order because they haven't sat in the order that I've written it. So as we begin the discussion, please do introduce yourself before you speak. Mike, so RPS and Tetra Tech work closely with lots of different businesses when it comes to nature consultancy services. Can you share some insight into what businesses should be considering when it comes to nature and why?
Thank you, Lee. So I'm Mike Barker. I run a team of about 85 ecologists in the UK. We're dotted around 15 different locations, and we work across a whole range of sectors. A lot of our clients are private sector businesses. We're doing a lot of work with house builders, mixed-use developers, but also at the moment, more and more renewable projects are coming across our door, and we're working on those. And there's some real interesting insights in terms of those sectors and nature, and particularly impacts on ecology in the UK and how that works. And I think, I've been working in the sector for 30 years. We've been doing ecological impacts for 30 years on planning and consenting new developments. What's been clear in that process is that there always have been small residual impacts on nature built into developments as they happen, which aren't necessarily always fully mitigated and compensated for. And what has changed recently is the government has brought in legislation which requires biodiversity net gain on all planning applications. That's become law in February of this year, and that's actually changing the way that development is done in the UK, well, in England. There are different systems coming forward in Wales and Scotland that will mirror this, but in England, biodiversity net gain is driven by DEFRA and the legislation there. And the way that it's working is it's picking up the mitigation hierarchy that we've always used in assessing ecological impacts from development. But what it is trying to do is capture all of those, setting a baseline, measuring those impacts, putting a value to them, and then making sure that there's always an uplift at the end. And the uplift that the government has set for now is 10%. There are some local authorities and regulators that are asking for more than 10% in places. And this is driving quite a lot of change. And actually, it's although it's only come into legislation in February, I've been working on biodiversity net gain for probably 3 or 4 years as people have been trying to get on the front foot on this. But it's really interesting to see how it's changing, even since February, the way that development is done. And if we look at that in relation to the mitigation hierarchy, it's changing how sites are being selected. If it has a high value in terms of ecology, then it's much harder to get a net gain at the end because you have to show an uplift. And so high value ecological sites are being avoided. Where there is ecology in place, then they're looking to minimize those impacts by looking at better design and building with nature and working with the grain of the sites that they're developing. It's also looking to provide mitigation in terms of work. Sorry, just remembering what the mitigation hierarchy was. So mitigation in terms of how that design works, so retaining habitats on site, using those sorts of habitats to look at how you can build those into design, and then enhancement where you're looking at restoration of neglected or low value ecology and habitats, and looking at and enhancing those and getting an uplift in biodiversity.
If I can just go to Catherine and just ask where, in the investment space, how and what is the most significant way financing can influence natural ecosystems?
So thinking about the question, it's very interesting. I believe that currently, among most institutional investors, the sort of importance placed on nature as an investment factor, it's growing, but it's definitely still below where we want it to be. It's not near the front of the queue in terms of factors that influence investment decisions. But for me, I think this creates an opportunity because as we educate investors on the impacts and materiality of their capital allocation decisions on nature, over time it should begin to impact capital flows, so redirect capital away from activities that are harming nature and more towards positive activities. And we'll probably come onto it in more detail a bit later in the discussion, but frameworks like the TNFD are hugely important as part of this education process, because if the data about the impact on nature of business activities is there, if it's in the annual report, the prospectus, the marketing document, it can't be ignored by investment committees who are making decisions about how to allocate capital. So they'll need to take nature into account, both from sort of a risk mitigation, but also a positive impact perspective. And then when we raise the profile of nature as an investment factor, I believe there's also a second order impact, because if the gatekeepers of capital are putting in place an investment hurdle in relation to nature, then businesses which need to raise capital now or are thinking about raising capital in the future, need to make nature a business priority. And I think this is important for, somewhat forcing the issue. I think that Lloyd made a really important point earlier about the difference between businesses that are mission-driven and businesses that are not. Because for mission-driven businesses, perhaps integration of nature might be slightly more straightforward, whereas for other organizations, they are retrofitting and they need to make nature a priority, and making it a factor that can influence how much capital they can attract is certainly one way to do that.
From your perspective, what are the key opportunities and challenges for businesses looking to invest in nature?
Thanks. Alex Tozer, Replanet. I think that the key challenges for businesses wanting to invest in nature are probably, there's lots of them, but there's a lot around risk of sort of perceived transparency. So something that when Replanet was started, that we really recognized was that philanthropy and government funding were never going to be enough to make any material, or to make the material change that's needed in the preservation of the natural world and biodiversity. And so the private sector has to come in. And so we were sort of set up in order to try and drive large-scale ecological restoration using private sector financing and using different financing gateways to do that. But when you're bringing the private sector in, then the risks that the private sector face are very different to the public sector and very different to the risks that philanthropists face. So if I'm sitting on a board of a large, FTSE 100 company, and I've got a choice where I can put millions of pounds into a project that there isn't really clear governance of, and that project could be fantastic for nature, it could do all these amazing things, but there's one negative article that's written about the project in The Guardian or in another paper or anything like that. And I think, well, that's actually worse than doing nothing. And so for the private sector, I think that the main challenge that they face really is being able to proudly shout about what they're doing. And to be able to do that and to say, actually, we know that there aren't lots of perfect solutions out there, but there are now some really nice mechanisms that are coming into play in order to facilitate that. And that, I think, is where the opportunities come in. And so I think we should all be really proud that we've got biodiversity net gain in England, because it's one of the only sort of government-led systems in the whole world that's actually really sort of quantifying and putting quite clear mitigation priorities onto businesses. So I think that's already a fantastic opportunity that everyone in the private sector is sort of encumbered with, but can actually now go out and do. But I think sort of moreover, then you've got now real opportunities with things like TNFD and CSRD. So these frameworks that allow businesses to report on their nature-based impacts means that actually people are starting to realize, the customers are starting to realize that sustainability is about more than just carbon, it's about more than just emissions, it's also massively about biodiversity. And there are now these opportunities for businesses to quantify biodiversity impacts and nature-based impacts within their supply chain. And within their business as a whole, and to look at not just what they're doing internally, but also the impacts right across the supply chain, and really report on those in a measured and clear way. And I think that that's sort of really where we came into this space, and I think it's a great opportunity now for the private sector to actually be a driving force in biodiversity change.
How does a renewable energy developer contribute to both positive and negative impacts on natural ecosystems?
Well, firstly, we come with significant investment from our bankers and investors. But I think it's important to start from the beginning with this. And we have seen significant changes with government reforms of late. The Labour government came in July this year and has already started setting about transforming the renewable energy industry. So, for example, we have this target to achieve net zero by 2050. The government also wants to see achieve decarbonisation of the energy sector by 2035. So that leaves us with just over a decade to decarbonise our energy sector. And the government has also introduced the Great British Energy to reform everything. And we also have recently seen the consultation documents on NPPF, that's the National Planning Policy Framework, which has brought about a complete reform of thinking behind renewable energy. Previously, we had a de facto ban on on onshore wind in England, and in Scotland we're seeing the complete opposite and have done for several years. So we are starting to see some really positive changes in planning reform. And we've also seen, as Mike and Alex have alluded to, BNG and the introduction of that in February this year, which has set about mandating a minimum of 10% BNG. So what we're doing as a developer is that when we're land sourcing, we have a geographical information system in-house which we've set up and designed ourselves so that we can source land. And the first part of that is understanding sensitivities, habitats, and opportunities as well. So we will look for sites where we know there are no sensitive designations, such as SSSIs, special areas of conservation. And we also, in part of the design, once we've got site selection, we will start thinking about buffer zones in and around of any constraints. We'll also look at other factors, such as agricultural land classification, buffer zones around residential areas, etc. We'll also look at sourcing the clean technology, and Kevin was talking about that earlier on as well. So we want to know that whatever technology we're bringing to site, we can offset that carbon. You know, it is usually manufactured offshore, so we look to do a trade-off and offset that carbon as part of our projects. As a developer, we want to be a good neighbour. That's not only just for the local community, but that's also for nature and wildlife. So yeah, we want to be good neighbours. One of the things that we have looked at is also proximity to peatland. We would never want to damage peatland whatsoever, but we see some areas as an opportunity. So for example, peatland which has, it's degraded, it's in poor condition, we can look to actually invest in restoring that and coming up with a very, very comprehensive restoration plan in addition to our planning proposals. So renewable energy in itself is clean technology. And obviously, in introducing the clean technology, we can have less reliance upon fossil fuels in the future. We all know the consequences of continued use of fossil fuels and the impacts on climate change. So as a developer, we can really, really go to town on the likes of BNG and all those kind of really good proposals. Also, in the long term, we usually seek planning permissions with a timescale. This allows us the flexibility to change the technology at times when we feel better technology is coming in, and it also allows us to return that land back to its former condition, if not better condition than what it previously was. So that's decommissioning, restoring the land to a high quality.
But one of the biggest challenges that businesses face is quantifying the return on or the value that they get from nature. And I think from, we've touched on compliance, we've touched on that overall kind of social license to operate, doing the right thing. But from your different sectors, how do you measure the business benefits of investing in nature and ecosystem health? And if I can direct this back to Rachel to kick us off, because I'm sure there are trade-offs when it comes to nature in development decision-making and renewable energy.
Yeah, absolutely, Lee. One of the difficulties we encounter is that, first and foremost, to be able to develop a renewable energy site, whether that's solar, battery, onshore wind, we have to have a grid supply. Grid supplies tend to be in open areas of countryside, which inevitably, sometimes that's habitat, sometimes that's agricultural land. But what we can find is even we can trade off with solar energy development, for example, which not only generates power for the grid, but we can also accommodate livestock grazing, and sheep happily graze under solar panels. In terms of other trade-offs, we also have landscape impacts, we have noise impacts, and it's really about trying to harmonise and find that balance. So what we tend to do is, once we've found the site, we will find additional land to try and achieve that biodiversity net gain. And as a developer, we're not looking for 10%, we're not looking for 20%. We'll go way beyond that and achieve 100%. And in some cases, 200%. It's easier with solar panels, for example. So we never stop trying to find those trade-offs. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but with collaboration with local authorities, county ecologists, and in trying to achieve that really comprehensive understanding and value of a site. And that's where we go to the likes of people who, like Mike, who can provide us with that expertise in how we can actually regenerate a site. And we'll look for those sites that have the lowest value, so that we can really invest in the mitigation to enhance, avoid, enhance, and Mike talked about the mitigation hierarchy. So that's something that we really look at as a developer as well.
You know, how do you and your clients, Mike, perceive the business case for nature? And if you could share some insights on those tangible benefits that you can get from focusing on nature, as well as the challenges across the various sectors that you work across.
I would say there's been a real sea change in my time in the business. Some of our developers, particularly some fairly hard-nosed house builders, if you go back to 10, 20 years, really ecology was one of the problems that they had. It just turned up on their sites. It was something that they needed to get rid of. It was always a problem. I think there's been an absolute change in the mindset, particularly around some of the larger house builders. They actually are looking at better design. They're building with nature. They are looking at how to mitigate impacts. But I've seen it this year in particular, that the biodiversity net gain mechanism is driving them away from sites that otherwise they would perhaps try and develop, but they're finding that actually the baseline values are such that they're not now building on those sites. And I've seen that happen just literally January, February this year. Sites have been pretty much abandoned rather than taking them to appeal, because really they were going to lose on biodiversity terms. But actually, I've also seen it in Cambridge. I'm based in Cambridge. There's a lot of housing and other development pressures there. In Greater Cambridgeshire, a lot of house building is being targeted for that area. There's some real pressures there around how you can have that much development sustainably, and there's issues around water scarcity in particular. And actually, East Anglia is really challenged in terms of water supply. And some of the issues around that are because if the abstraction locally is causing nature impacts on the riverine systems, chalk streams. Chalk streams are one of the rare habitats that occur in British Isles. Disproportionately, we have over 200 of them. It's almost 80% of the global resource in chalk streams, particularly in south and southern and eastern England. And that they are really very sensitive to over abstraction, and actually at the moment, a number of developments are being challenged because water supply is a real issue. Where is the water going to come from for these houses? And actually, that environment is so water stressed that one particular water company, Essex and Suffolk Water, has put a ban on a business growth in one of their catchments. They've basically said for the next 8 years, they're not going to supply new businesses in that area because they have an investment plan that's going to take at least 8 years before they can have a sustainable source. And that water is coming from the Humber. They're piping it from the Humber all the way down to Essex. And that's not terribly sustainable, but fundamentally, if there's no rain falling or not enough rain falling in Essex and Suffolk, that's the only way they're going to get water. The alternative was desalination, and actually that's not very sustainable either. So they're caught slightly in between things, but that water scarcity is driven by climate change. And I think actually, and you go full circle and you say, well, how do you look at impacts on climate, on nature? And one of the key ways to offset impacts on nature is to deal with climate change.
Thanks, Mike. We absolutely have to protect our chalk streams, groundwater-fed, ranunculus-filled, lovely rivers that we have, and agree. Not only that in terms of people's dependencies, but all the other added social, spiritual, less kind of, I guess, more esoteric services that you get from nature often gets missed. And we talk about impacts around nature. And we know that nature is a bit more complex than measuring climate. Climate is perhaps one metric. So Catherine, how important are metrics and indices across nature, and how are kind of financiers starting to think about this more quantitatively in the context of riding the wave of climate action?
Sure. So I think in terms of the importance of metrics and indices for, the sort of financial ecosystem, probably the importance of the metrics, can't really be understated. I think they'll really be quite crucial for actually driving change. And I think the first point to consider here is the importance of nature-related metrics to banks like the Royal Bank of Canada, but also our peers. Because I think quantitative measures really allow us to track and work out how nature-related impacts and factors should map to the cost of capital. So in my role, we set the price at which equity investors are asked to provide capital, and we also have a very large corporate lending team that lend out our balance sheet to businesses, and they work out the appropriate rate of interest to charge. So if we're actually able to look at nature and quantitatively map, financial risk reward, we can really start to facilitate a reduced cost of capital for organisations that have a positive impact on nature. And that's something that we already do for factors like GHG emissions. We are able to offer a lower cost of capital to businesses whose emissions are lower or who are able to demonstrate an improvement. So really, if we're able to get there for nature over time, that will be a huge positive. I think metrics and indices are also quite important for investors. So a lot of institutional investors in the city, they use computer and data-driven screens to filter for potential investment opportunities, and then they sort of apply the human overlay to the investments that pass through the filter. And typically it's factors like valuation, yield, liquidity, etc., but also ESG ratings. And I think adding nature-related metrics into the mix will be a really important way of sort of raising the profile of nature-positive investments and redirecting capital flows over the long term. Although when I think about metrics and indices, there is also a risk, right? Because the data needs to be robust. If metrics are open to misinterpretation or are not well understood, actually there is a risk that the metrics could be, detrimental to the process of helping capital allocators to understand their impact on nature. So this is where frameworks like TNFD and like science-based targets are hugely important, because they help provide guidance to the people who are measuring the data, and they help to provide context to people like investors who might not have a huge amount of knowledge but are tasked with interpreting the data. And I think they can sort of bridge the gap between the huge amounts of research that's been conducted into nature, and the group of investors who are sort of tasked with interpreting data that relates to their impact on nature.
Thanks, Kat. Data and metrics is absolutely key to the nature discussion. It feels like it's key to a lot of the themes that have been discussed today as well. And I guess if you work across nature, I'm really glad the conversation is moving kind of away from, those keystone species, the fluffy animals, and it's actually starting to drill down to the science-based, evidence-led, topical questions around nature. And Alex, the industry that you're working across with regard to offering a solution for nature, and then touching on the same theme of questioning around the business case, you interact with a lot of investors, I'm sure. What are their kind of business drivers to actually investing in a nature-based solution? And I guess, first of all, what is a nature-based solution?
Thanks. First of all, I'm really glad that Catherine said that metrics are important, because otherwise it would have succinctly rubbished our business model entirely. So I was pretty glad about that. What is a nature-based solution? Well, a nature-based solution is effectively any way of generating an output that is beneficial to nature. And so when we talk about nature-based solutions in our sector, then quite often people will look at carbon projects as a potential for nature-based solutions. So if you're a business that wants to offset your carbon emissions, then you can do a few things. You might want to invest in DAC, so direct air capture, for example, and that's where you can effectively, someone might build a machine that sucks carbon dioxide out of the air. That's not a nature-based solution. Whereas if you're planting trees or if you're doing something in nature, then you have got a natural solution that's generating benefits for biodiversity as well, which is also generating those carbon credits. And there's a whole world of nature-based solutions out there. I think the key from our perspective has always been about being able to put nature succinctly on the balance sheet. And that really comes down to quantification, because if you can properly securitize something, if you can say, well, nature isn't this intangible thing that just kind of feels nice and looks good and that we can sing about happily, then that's where you can then move it out of the philanthropy and government sector and into the private sector. And so for us, it's really all about being able to quantify it properly, because most organizations, most investors, when they're looking for a nature-based project, then typically they'll have a carbon target, or they'll have some sort of emissions offsets requirement that they're looking for, but also they'll have now they'll have some biodiversity or nature-based reporting targets. And frankly, most organizations don't really know what they're going to have to do, but they know they're going to have to do something. Because there's new reporting requirements coming in. People look at things like the TNFD and CSRD and think, well, what does this actually mean for my business? And so what I think that we as project developers and as advisors in that space need to be able to do is to really tell organizations, this is what you can potentially put your funds into, and this is what it will bring you. And that might mean quantifying it by a certain percentage of uplift. So saying over 30 years, we've achieved a 200% uplift in this target site. Across our supply chain, we've achieved X percentage uplift in biodiversity. And when you're talking about biodiversity, then you have to be able to say, what that actually means, because one of the biggest problems that the nature-based solutions market or space has had is, how on earth do you quantify biodiversity? So carbon's quite easy to quantify because it's a molecule, so you can measure it. Whereas how on earth do you measure something as seemingly intangible as biodiversity? And so there's now different metrics, different ways of doing it. And so, we spent a lot of time suggesting and putting together, working in a big working group with like the World Economic Forum, IUCN, UNDP, lots of different stakeholders to sort of put forward these methodologies that were then taken up by the Wallacea Trust and turned into this way which sort of mirrors like the consumer price index, a way of actually measuring the important metrics within biodiversity that are relevant to the ecosystem in which you're operating. So it mirrors the CPI because when we compare inflation rates between China and England, then you look at a basket of goods, you look at what people are buying in those places. They're not the same things, but you can still compare something that's derived from them. So you can still compare things like inflation and the economies. And so we took a similar approach. And so that ultimately enables businesses, and it crucially enables custodians of nature. So, whether that's farmers, whether that's landowners, small landholders, large landholders, enormous businesses with massive environmental assets, it enables them to be able to quantify and monetize those assets, monetize that part of the picture. And so that's sort of what we're trying to do. But I think the crucial thing then is that making it tangible and being able to advise on things like CSRD and the TNFD and those really clear metrics, so that businesses ultimately they want to be able to say quantifiably and clearly, this is the difference that we have made.
So nature market, we'll stick on this theme for now. Nature markets are obviously critical to start investors understanding how much we could actually get from nature. Because I guess the challenge with nature-based solutions historically has been, well, it's an offset, and therefore you're skipping all of the mitigation hierarchy of avoidance. But perhaps you can contextualize that with the task in hand, right, in terms of the global biodiversity framework, the decline in nature, and then obviously what we want to do is recover in nature. And so what's your perspective on that with regard to a do nothing scenario, or actually do something about nature recovery?
I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the conversation has been about offsets. And I think that now the frameworks are enabling organizations to move away from that mindset and to start thinking more about mitigation. Because ultimately, if you can measure, then it means that you know what you're doing right now within your supply chain. And so that then means that you can then start looking at ways in which you can reduce impacts. You can champion a project that might mean everything from changing the way that you are farming wheat or changing the way that you're grazing cattle, through to things like tree planting on agricultural land. There's lots of different ways that within a supply chain you can then start significantly reducing your impacts on nature. And so again, quantifying that, measuring that is something that can then be brought to companies. And ultimately that quantification process, the securitizing it, means that then investors come to play, because if there's something that can be quantified, then that something can usually be bought and sold, and if you can buy and sell it, then bingo, you're into capital markets, and that's where you can really scale, and that's what ultimately we need is scale. So yeah, I think moving away from offsets is really, really important, and I mean, that's not to say that offsets are bad, absolutely not, because I hope not, because we deal or we encourage lots of people to offset. But I think that it's changing the mindset so that organizations are not just thinking about offsite, offset, polluter pays, we can do this, but it's all right because we do something else somewhere else, but actually thinking about within our supply chain, what can we change, what can we alter, and how do we measure that? And that's where the new frameworks and new opportunities for measurement really are making a difference and should be making a tangible difference, I think.
Thanks, Alex. And I think our conversation has absolutely been focused on where we can have impact at scale. And by virtue of that, we're focusing on capital markets where the money is, and that will make the difference. But for businesses, I think, going down to that scale where you can relate to it at a business level, perhaps, Rachel, do you have any kind of, I guess, any applications or strategies that perhaps businesses could take from the way in which you approach development that could be applicable to businesses?
Yeah, absolutely, Lee. I think there's a range of initiatives that different industries can adopt. I think one of the things that could be looked at amongst perhaps aviation and the residential sector as well is how you can combine biodiversity with recreation and education. For example, some of the sites that we're developing at the moment, we're bringing forwards fantastic ideas for nature reserves. And that's on site as well, so in and around the, whether that's solar or battery. And we're looking at introducing species which are not there as part of the baseline. So we're really, really enhancing that site. And obviously we need to understand the site first and foremost. So it's about investing in those surveys, getting the best ecologists, getting the best landscape architects to come and come together and collaborate to create this fantastic opportunity as part of these developments. So one of the ideas is the nature reserves. So we're bringing forward nature reserves with the idea of allowing school children to come and learn from the nature reserve, learn about renewable energy, having bird hides around wetland areas so that people can come and enjoy the different variety of bird species which will be attracted to the area. We're also introducing outdoor classrooms into the development as well, so that local school children can come and enjoy the area and understand about what we're doing and see the fantastic biodiversity and nature that we're bringing to the site. All this comes at a cost, and what we're looking to do as well is set up a community foundation. And we are bringing in the region of £1 million per project to invest in the local community. And as part of that, we are having public consultation events and speaking directly with the public to see how they would like to see that money spent in the area. And that could be sustainable transport, it could be sustainable farming, and even just introducing that word sustainability, that further down the line, that you'll have that impact upon reducing climate change and the effects of that. So we're bringing forward all those kind of fantastic ideas to not only to regenerate, to kind of create renewable energy, but also bring much needed investment into a lot of communities.
Thanks. Just like supply chain, it affects all of us in terms of our decision making and where we're spending money. And it sounds like due diligence is a key part of whether it's on an individual level, i.e. where does our pensions go, versus, at a business level, where is our capital and procurement going? Is it going to harmful activities or is it going to nature positive activities? And just the last two questions before we cut to the audience for some questions. But so Catherine, how would you start differentiating investors who are integrating nature in finance and those who are still undecided?
So I think there's a couple of key factors here. One of them Kevin alluded to earlier, actually. So if you take Next Energy Capital, for example, they are making investment decisions, but they get their capital from somewhere else. They might have an investment from BlackRock, for example, and actually BlackRock might have that capital from a pension fund. So it's quite a mechanical factor, but if we go up the chain of where the capital actually originates from, if that pension fund is very focused on nature, then BlackRock has to be, and then Next Energy has to be. So it's quite a mechanical yet very important factor. So that's one point. I'd say another is the ethos of the investor, and that could be driven by strength of their leadership, it could be driven by their mission, but that really determines whether, in relation to nature, which is quite an emerging field for investors, are they going to be a leader, or is it more likely that they're going to sit back and wait to see what market practice is and then just follow the market practice? And then I'd say the third factor for an investor is probably their understanding of the topic, understanding of nature and how actually to integrate it. And this is where some of the frameworks that I mentioned earlier become hugely important. So thinking about, what can businesses which offer positive impacts on nature do to attract capital? I'd say step one is definitely, developing a very fulsome understanding, of the business impact on nature, and then being able to articulate a very sort of concise and relevant narrative around that externally is sort of the most important thing to do.
Are there trends that are emerging around businesses and those challenges that they need to address, particularly when it comes to the resource-intensive industries in the context of nature?
Clearly there are, and I think actually the topic of palm oil has come up once or twice already. And just as an example, traceability and visibility of where those commodities come from, whether it's palm oil or whether it's a mineral, copper, that it's coming from an extractive sector as well. That you really need to be able to, within the metrics that you're building up, you need to have data that is transparent and relatable to a geography. You have to say where it's coming from, because otherwise, how can you measure the ecological impact? The ecological impact happens on the ground where the commodity is resourced from. And so you need to measure the baseline there, and you need to understand the ecological impact of the extractive or the manufacturing process. And similarly with pollution at the other end of the supply chain, trying to close that loop, understanding what those emissions are, reducing the emissions, ensuring that there isn't pollution, long-lived chemicals in the environment going into the water, into river systems and the oceans. So it's that supply chain transparency that is absolutely key, because that provides reliable data that goes into the metrics that allows the money people to understand and quantify and be able to compare different investments and make sensible choices about where investments should go. And I think, sorry if I'm summing up, but one thing that really struck me is that actually the UK and England in particular, because it's got the biodiversity net gain metric, it's really opened up an opportunity for the UK to be a leader in this field in terms of financial institutions being able to provide nature-based solutions that are absolutely embedded in science and measurable, quantifiable ecological improvement and enhancement. So you can see the biodiversity increases on the land, you can measure them. And I think that's really important. And the renewable sector is definitely out ahead on this. Onshore wind, we do a lot of work in Scotland. Most of our work is around peatland restoration and raptors. We spend a lot of time looking at raptors and making sure that the peatland restoration and the habitat restoration provides an ecosystem where those sorts of top predators can exist in harmony with the wind farms, which are built somewhere slightly out of the way so they don't bump into each other. And that whole knitting together is really key to making sure that nature-based solutions really work.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone, for your really valuable insights. I think, as a sum up before we have questions, it's a complex topic, nature, and off the back of the momentum built by climate action, I think it's well understood that all businesses interact with nature. Our well-being is dependent on nature, and it's not until we start understanding how we interact with nature and its natural resources, as well as the services that they provide, until we can actually make some meaningful impact, either manage that risk or even leverage the opportunities that come from it. Businesses are only just starting to understand it, and it's something that we shouldn't shy away from. We've got the Global Biodiversity Framework, and we've got IPBES telling us that, we're in this catastrophic decline in nature, and we're past the tipping point. And I think this is the elephant in the room, really, for all of us, is that we need to address this head on. It needs to be at the top of the list of acknowledging that we are fundamentally all, I don't want to be too negative, but doomed if we don't start thinking about this seriously, right? Natural capital accounting, understanding how we interact with it, making sure that we're measuring it, making sure that we really understand what our risk exposures are across our business. And not until then, we can then implement some strategic action across all of our businesses to make it more resilient, and ultimately successful in the medium to long term. I'd like to open it to the floor now to get some questions.
Thanks very much, guys, for the panel discussion. My name's Sam McGuire. I run a sustainability consulting practice. There's a lot of discussion around metrics and the importance of metrics, and they're incredibly valuable in terms of driving change. But for me, there's two aspects that have to go with it. There has to be a fundamental understanding of nature and its complexity outside of metrics. And there has to be an intimacy, a love and care of nature as well from individuals. It can't just be numbers on a spreadsheet. So one of the things that I'm trying to build into my practice is how can we get people out of the offices, out of their buildings and going and interacting with nature. I guess would love to hear from you guys how best you've seen, exposure to nature driving change, and how you've maybe applied some of that thinking.
Thank you very much for what you've been talking about. For my understanding, how much of what you're talking about is businesses explicitly doing the things you're talking about because they have to, and how much is coming implicitly because of the business operation itself? It implicitly does good. Are you seeing, have you got any examples, or have you got a, so it's the very presence and the operation of the business or the asset or the investment?
Well, in York, as everybody knows, we have a lot of problems with water. And I always say, because I live part of the time in the Netherlands, why don't you consult the Dutch? Because obviously they know what to do with water. So does that happen? Do you go to countries that you think, okay, they're doing something that is what we can learn from? Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we've got one on metrics, and how do we, I guess, drive change and get people out and actually acknowledge that, get people in touch with nature to really understand what the intricacies are. We've got a question around, are businesses doing it because of compliance, regulatory, or are there, can we give some examples about other reasons and other drivers? And then, are we collaborating where impacts might be more apparent in other geographies? And does that knowledge sharing work? I'll pass it on to our panel, whoever wants to take any of those.
I'm tempted to do the last two, but I'll do the first one, which is getting people out into nature and how do we build that reconnection between people and nature. And I think actually this is something that it's really about integrating good design in development. It's about people and places. It's about multifunctional green space where you've got recreational use, you've got surface water management, you've got nature and nature conservation all in the same place. And so people can just through osmosis really just be in nature without necessarily having to go to a nature reserve. You know, it's green space on their doorstep. And I think access to green spaces, it is a government priority. They have recognized that people need to have access to green spaces for well-being, for mental well-being. That is difficult, particularly in urban environments. But there's some really interesting projects around nature-based solutions for pocket parks, and actually knitting that together with collaboration. There's some really interesting design around replanting really species diverse small pocket parks that has been pioneered elsewhere in Europe, that has come across and been incorporated here. And that sort of collaboration about best practice is actually, in the environmental world, we're magpies. We do like to go and borrow good ideas. And I think actually things like the renewable sector, so not necessarily onshore wind, but onshore wind is part of that. But I also work offshore in terms of offshore wind. And offshore wind development is very much a global market. And actually things like marine compensation and those sorts of ideas, but also how those projects come ashore, because they all have to come ashore. They all have cable routes that have to connect to the grid. They're very attuned to building in these sorts of social benefits as well, mainly driven by the Scandinavians, I have to say, particularly the Danish, but there you go.
In terms of getting people out in nature and out to site, this is something that we have found to be hugely important for raising awareness of nature. So one of my clients is Next Energy Solar Fund, which is a listed solar fund, and there are regularly investor visits out to see the sites. And when investors sign up, you know, they primarily want to often know about things like how the assets are being managed to maximize generation, and they want to come and look at some of the co-located batteries and that sort of thing. But actually, Next Energy make a huge effort when investors are on site to talk to them about natural capital and the impact on nature. And actually, it always comes up hugely in the investor feedback from those visits. You know, I didn't know that they were doing all of this, but now I do know. You know, I'm much more interested to sort of follow and see whether, you know, other companies are doing similar. So getting people out to site is really important. One thing that we should probably do more of is getting more people out to site. So often we would have the portfolio manager, but who we're not bringing is the stewardship teams. So at most large investment institutions, there are stewardship teams that are making sure that factors like nature and broader sustainability are integrated into investment decisions. These guys actually probably know an awful lot about nature, and sort of getting them out to site as well is something that we should do more of. And then on the second question, I think there's definitely sectors to which nature considerations does play more naturally. So again, solar parks is an example because it's very land intensive. You know, these businesses are much more cognizant day to day of the impact on nature. In terms of my role, I'm a generalist, so I also look after banks and healthcare companies. And I would say that the management teams are just more disconnected from their impact on nature, even though they know that they have one. And to bridge that gap, I would say there's probably a need for industry-specific guidance to help companies at least start to think about their responsibilities and what they should be doing, so that they can then take that away and start to implement it.
In reference to the first project on exposure to nature and driving change, our company logo is growing by nature, and that's something that we maintain and strive to do every day of our working week. We also, in terms of getting out onto site, when we have a project in the early stages, we will be out there getting a full understanding of that, and that will be alongside our suppliers, and also in with the local authorities where they have the capacity to join us to discuss different features, different characteristics and potential impacts of developing a particular site. So we always strive to engage and to collaborate. And also, alongside that, we engage with local schools and take them to site and teach them about renewable energy and the importance of it for their future as well. I think on the second point, doing things because whether we do it because we're a business or we're not, well, first and foremost, I'm not just a town planner, I'm a chartered environmentalist, and it's something that's ingrained within me. I live in the countryside, I value the countryside, and I wish to protect the countryside, but I also wish to provide a sustainable future for my children and their children as well. Obviously, we have to comply with minimum standards. Yep, planning standards, BNG. But I did mention earlier, we're not looking for 10% BNG, we're not looking for 20, we're looking for in excess of 100% BNG without fail. And if that means buying extra land to do that, we always try and aim to do that on site rather than off site. That's something we seek to do as well. All of our staff internally are trained to at the highest of standards. We bring in experts to make sure all of our project developers have a full understanding of new techniques, new technology, the best of technology. So everyone is fully up to speed with all the industry standards. We are supported internally, so the project developers by planning team. So I've got a planning team of 5 to provide all that much needed knowledge and expertise alongside our suppliers. We also seek to have the best of suppliers supporting us in the industry and ensuring that our projects are the best in the industry.
Okay, thanks. I'll probably go 3, 2, 1 in terms of the questions. So for the third question, which was about sort of international collaboration, I completely agree that it is. You know, why don't you see it more often where people take ideas from other countries? And I think it's something that we certainly try to do as much as we can. You know, you look to Holland, for example, where you've got you know, these amazing sort of rewilding sites, which then the UK has tried to copy a little bit and has had some fantastic success in doing. Probably the premier rewilding site in the UK was modelled or inspired by the Dutch rewilding site. So I think that there is some sort of copying that goes across. The big problem that you tend to find, of course, is that the sort of jurisdiction and cultural differences can really restrict and can really make it hard to take something that's happening and working really well in Honduras and do it in Mexico, because if you have a different jurisdiction, that can be a challenge. But I think certainly as much as we can, and I think we all love trying to do that. The second question about compliance versus sort of intrinsic motivation. I think that both are true in reality. Sort of pragmatically, as we look at the organizations that are engaging with nature, then quite a lot of them do it because they either think they have to, or they think they're going to have to, and they're worried about the risk of not doing anything on their, the reputational risk. And so in a sense, they're doing it because they have to, but that, is that so bad? Probably not, because in a sense, as an organization, since the year dot, companies have been trying to manage reputational risk and have been trying to make sure that their assets from one way or another are protected. So I kind of think that's fine. But then you also have the more sort of inherent risk that some organizations face that can be mitigated by nature-based solutions. And a great example of that is things like flood risks. And if your organization is heavily dependent on coastal resources, then things like tsunamis and flood risk become very, very important. And so if you can then invest and put money into mangrove restoration, then you're not just protecting your own supply chain, you're making a big impact to the environment, but also you're potentially generating, again, a sort of an asset, something that can actually be traded. So there's a financial incentive as well. And so I think that all different ways can be true. Finally, in terms of the sort of connection with nature and how you do that, I think at a grassroots level, similar to what Mike was saying, then in particular in cities, that's where you have this nature deficit, the most of this big disconnect. And so at a grassroots level, then public parks, those sorts of easy access to nature is something which in this country, hopefully the government will continue to put funds into, because I think it's going to fundamentally make a difference. But then at a wider scale, at the investment scale, then I think that all organizations engaging in a nature-based solution need to factor in the importance of taking the executive team or taking decision makers into nature at some point, and that can be that means you have to have a budget somewhere to do a trip with investors or to do a trip with the people that are going to make some decisions, because I've certainly seen it where we've taken groups from a bank who are wondering about the risks of doing a project in Honduras or something like that. You take them into the area, you show them actually what's happening, and when they can see the impact that it's having on people's lives, they can see the impact on communities, but they can also see trees growing, or they can see a landscape changing, then that really can be a light bulb moment. It can really change things. And so I think that everyone needs to consider that part of the communication.
I'd like to thank you for the really great questions. They're spot on and very aligned with the topic. And I'd like to thank the panel for their time and really valuable insight. Again, it's a complex topic, so let's carry on the conversation over lunch. Thank you.